"Honey, why aren't you living in the cottage I bought for you?" Mom asked, shocked to find us in that tiny, shabby apartment. Mark snapped, "I gave that cottage to my sister. Your daughter didn't deserve it." Mom paused for 2 seconds and then said something that even left me stunned. "Please like and subscribe. Enjoy the video." Aline felt the floor tilt beneath her. The cottage in Cypress Hills. The dream home she had cried over when Valerie placed the deed in her hands on her wedding day. Gone? Just like that? Given away? Mark didn't even look at her. Behind him stood Linda, his mother, arms folded with proprietary satisfaction. And on the sofa, legs crossed, nail polish drying, sat his younger sister Christine, smirking like someone who had just won a prize she hadn't earned. Aline's hands shook as she stared at the papers on the table. A transfer of ownership. Her name gone. Christine's name printed where hers should have been. Her stomach twisted. "You can't do this," she whispered. Mark laughed. "Sure I can. You're my wife. Everything that's yours is ours. I handled our shared property, that's all." "But the house was in my name," Aline said, voice trembling. "Was," he corrected. "Now it's in hers." Christine lifted her freshly painted nails. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of it." The humiliation burned more than the shock. It wasn't just the house. It was the way they spoke to her, around her, over her, as if she wasn't even in the room. Linda smirked. "Family deserves family property, not outsiders." Aline stepped back, horror climbing her spine. She needed to leave, to call her mother, to call a lawyer, to breathe. But Mark moved faster, blocking the doorway. "Going somewhere?" "Yes," Aline managed. "To tell my mother what you did." "No," he said, grabbing her arm. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. "You'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." The threat wasn't empty. She felt it in his grip. And yet none of this had started this way. Only a year earlier, Aline was living a quiet, simple life in Phoenix, working as a receptionist in a small beauty salon. Her paycheck barely covered rent and groceries, but she managed. Her mother lived in another state, always buried in business meetings, traveling, building her company. They talked once a week, sometimes less, but Valerie always sent warmth through every call, even if half of them came from airports. Aline was used to handling life alone. Then one chaotic morning changed everything. She overslept, spilled coffee on her shirt, sprinted toward the metro, slipped on the stairs, and spilled the entire contents of her purse like confetti across the platform. She sat there blinking back tears, rubbing her bruised knee, thinking, "Perfect. Exactly what I needed." Then a voice beside her. "Hold on, I've got you." A tall blonde guy crouched beside her, gathering her things with a friendly smile that seemed almost too warm for a stranger. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said softly. "Thanks." That was the first time she met Mark Henderson. He walked her all the way to the salon, made her laugh despite the awful morning, asked for her number, and called that same evening. He was charming, disarmingly charming. He talked openly about being an engineer at a local manufacturing plant, told funny stories, walked her home after work even if it was far out of his way, bought small gifts, wildflowers, a book she mentioned once. Her loneliness thawed, her heart opened, dates twice a week, then 3 times. Then he invited her to meet his family. That was the beginning of the end, though she didn't know it then. Linda opened the door of her old, suffocating apartment with a stare sharp enough to cut glass, asking questions like a border agent. Where she worked, how much she made, whether she had property, car, savings. Christine barely looked up from her phone except to sneer. "Do you even have a driver's license?" "No." "Thought so." But Aline tried to believe it was just awkward first meeting energy. 4 months later, Mark proposed. She said yes. And the wedding, small but sweet, had one unforgettable moment. Valerie standing with a champagne flute, announcing the wedding gift. A fully furnished cottage outside Austin, a home for her daughter's future. A dream, wrapped and handed over. Aline had never felt so loved. Mark had never looked so grateful. Christine had never looked so jealous. And now, standing in this suffocating apartment, watching her husband grin like he had just pulled off a masterstroke, Aline finally understood. The jealousy never went away. It grew teeth. The cottage had seemed like the beginning of a new life. It took only a few weeks for it to become the beginning of Aline's slow undoing. At first, everything looked perfect. The house sat at the end of a leafy street outside Austin, with wide windows and a wraparound porch that caught the afternoon sun like a postcard. Valerie had furnished it beautifully. Soft rugs, a spacious kitchen, warm lighting, rooms that smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paint. It felt safe. It felt hers. For the first couple of weeks, Aline moved through it in a kind of wonder, unpacking slowly, learning where the light hit best in the mornings, cooking simple dinners with Mark, believing, truly believing, that she'd finally stepped into the stable, peaceful life she'd always wanted. Then Linda arrived, not for a visit, for a takeover. She came the first weekend with a casserole dish and the expression of someone inspecting a rental property she might buy. "Oh, this wallpaper is depressing," she said upon entering the guest room. "And these pans?" She banged one loudly. "Cheap, useless. You need proper cookware. I'll bring some." Aline laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Mark didn't notice a thing. He was too busy showing his mother the master suite. The next day, Linda returned, with more criticism, more suggestions, more boundary stomping. By the third week, she didn't even knock. She used the spare key she borrowed from Mark. She began rearranging the kitchen cabinets, correcting Aline's grocery shopping, folding laundry her own way, leaving snide comments about Aline's cooking, cleaning, habits, clothes. "You didn't grow up in a real family, so you probably don't know how a proper home works," she said one morning while wiping down a spotless counter. Aline stared at her. "I grew up fine," Linda smirked. "Sure, sweetheart, if you say so." When Aline told Mark, he shrugged. "She means well. Don't be dramatic." The following week, Linda brought a suitcase. "I'll stay through the weekend," she announced. She stayed through the month. Then Christine showed up. The sister floated through the door like she owned the place, hair curled, wearing leggings and a crop top as if it were her personal runway. "I'll use the upstairs loft," she declared. "Perfect lighting for photos." She did not ask. She did not plan to leave. Aline felt her ribs tighten every time she climbed the stairs and saw Christine's shoes scattered across the landing, strangers sprawled on her sofa on Friday nights, beer bottles on the kitchen island she scrubbed every morning. Mark defended them relentlessly. "She's my sister. She needs a place to stay. We have room. Why do you care so much?" And then came the chores, the expectations, the new reality. Aline worked from 9 to 6 at the salon, handling walk-ins, scheduling, angry clients, non-stop phones. She came home exhausted, and still she was expected to make dinner, clean up after Christine's friends, do laundry for 4 adults, scrub the floors Linda insisted were never clean enough. The cottage, her gift, was no longer her refuge. It was a battlefield where she had no weapons. Mark shifted first. The sweetness vanished. The attentiveness evaporated. He became impatient, irritated, dismissive. When she asked him to help, he'd sneer, "You work at a salon. What exactly is so exhausting about that?" When she asked why Christine had brought 3 strange men to their living room, he snapped, "Stop policing my family." When she tried to set boundaries, he glared at her like she'd insulted him personally. "You're my wife. That means you respect my people." And then came the first time he pushed her. It was small. Quick, a hand to her shoulder when she tried to stand in his way during one of his temper spikes. She told herself it didn't count. Everyone argues, she reasoned. He's stressed. But the next time was worse. Aline came home late from her shift at the gym, her second job, because Linda and Christine kept borrowing money, and found Mark pacing the living room. "Where were you?" he demanded. "At work. Don't lie to me." When she tried to walk past him, he grabbed her arm, fingers digging deep. When she pulled away, his grip tightened until tears stung her eyes. "You don't walk away from me." She slept in the guest room that night, on top of the covers, fully dressed, heart hammering against her ribs. And still, she didn't call her mother. Shame glued her silence shut. Shame and fear and the belief that she had chosen this man, that she should fix things, that Valerie had gifted her a home and she needed to prove she deserved it. But it only got darker. Linda began asking for help with her medical bills. Christine borrowed money for clothes, makeup, trips. Mark insisted Aline cover the rising utility bills. She worked 2 jobs, slept maybe 5 hours a night, and lost weight she didn't have to lose. Her hair thinned, her eyes dulled, her smiles disappeared. Mark barely noticed. Linda critiqued her more. Christine giggled behind her back. Aline felt herself fading, day by day, into a version of herself she no longer recognized. Quiet, fearful, ghost-like. The cottage walls felt closer each night. Then came the night that ended everything. The night Mark placed the forged documents on the coffee table and said the words that detonated her life. "I transferred the cottage to Christine. You didn't earn it." That was the night fear finally broke her silence. The night she dialed her mother. The night Valerie heard her daughter cry in a way she hadn't heard since Aline was a child. And Valerie's voice, cold steel behind every syllable, had said only, "Lock your door, sleep, I will be there in the morning." Aline didn't know then, but those words were the beginning of a war. Valerie arrived the next morning with the precision of a woman who had never once missed a flight, a deadline, or a chance to defend her own blood. Aline heard the doorbell while she was still brushing her hair, hands shaking, heart pounding so loudly it felt like the entire house could hear it. Downstairs, Linda grumbled as she shuffled toward the door, already annoyed that anyone dared disturb her morning routine. But when she opened it and saw Valerie Thompson standing on the porch, tall, poised, dressed in a charcoal suit as sharp as a blade, the irritation on her face collapsed into a pale, startled rigidity. Valerie didn't raise her voice, didn't introduce herself warmly, didn't bother pretending. She stepped inside with a calm that felt more dangerous than anger. "Where is my daughter?" she asked. Linda stammered something about coffee, about coming inside properly, about not making a scene. Valerie walked past her without a glance, her heels striking hardwood one controlled step at a time, and Aline felt her breath catch when she saw her mother step into the living room. For a moment she wanted to run into her arms like a child, but shame held her back. The bruises, the exhaustion, the truth of the life she'd been hiding from this woman who had given her everything. When Valerie finally looked at Aline, really looked, there was a long, terrible pause, as if the room itself fell silent. Valerie reached out and gently lifted her daughter's chin to see the faint yellowing bruise beneath her eye, the shadow along her jaw, the tremor in her posture. Aline whispered, "Mom, I'm fine." And Valerie's eyes hardened into something cold and calculating. "Who did this?" she asked, not loudly, but in a tone that carried authority born from decades of command. Mark stumbled in from the hallway, still wearing sweatpants and yesterday's shirt, his expression sour at the idea of uninvited guests. He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but Valerie was already striding across the room, picking up the stack of forged documents he had proudly waved the night before. She examined them the way a banker inspects counterfeit cash, quick, decisive, unimpressed. "Where did you get these?" she asked. Mark crossed his arms, trying to appear confident, claiming everything was legal, claiming he had every right as Aline's husband. Valerie didn't even bother to look at him. "These signatures are forged. The seal is fake. The notary number is invalid. And you are lying." He sputtered, trying to recover. "You can't talk to me like that in my house." That was the moment Valerie finally raised her eyes to him, one slow, contemptuous glance. "This is my daughter's house," she corrected, "and you have 10 seconds to stop speaking before you embarrass yourself further." For the first time, Mark faltered, his confidence cracking under the weight of someone he could not intimidate. Linda rushed to defend her son, flapping her hands, insisting Valerie was mistaken, insisting the house was theirs now, insisting Aline had obligations as a wife. Valerie stepped closer, her voice calm and crystal clear. "Obligations? To tolerate abuse? To fund your entire family? To surrender property gifted solely to her? No. The only obligation she has is to pack her things." The room shifted. Air tightened. Christine appeared on the staircase, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that faltered when Valerie addressed her directly. "You are the one who accepted stolen property. That makes you complicit. Stay out of my way." What happened next would replay in Aline's mind for the rest of her life. When Valerie attempted to go upstairs to collect Aline's things, Linda threw herself in front of the staircase, arms out like a guard dog, furious, trembling, irrational. "You are not taking her anywhere," she snapped. She belongs here with family." Valerie didn't shout, didn't insult, didn't even quicken her breath. She simply placed both hands on Linda's shoulders and pushed her aside with deliberate, effortless strength. Linda yelped as she stumbled backward onto the sofa, screeching accusations of assault. Christine gasped. Mark lunged a step forward, grabbing Valerie's wrist. "You don't touch my mother," he growled. But Valerie was faster. She twisted his arm with a precision that was almost clinical, forcing him onto his knees with a strangled sound of pain. "If you raise your hand again," she told him quietly, "I will end this conversation very differently." Aline stood frozen. She had never seen her mother like this, not as the successful executive she knew, but as something fiercer, colder, unstoppable. Valerie released Mark without ceremony and turned to her daughter. "Get your essentials," she said. "We are leaving." Aline rushed upstairs, stuffing clothes, documents, and her small jewelry box into 2 bags. Her hands trembled the whole time, but she kept hearing her mother's calm, unshakable voice in her head, steadying her. When she returned downstairs, all 3 Hendersons stood clustered together. Mark furious and humiliated, Linda shaking with resentment, Christine glaring with yellow-eyed jealousy. Mark attempted one last stand. If she walks out now, she's destroying this family. Valerie placed a hand on Aline's back, guiding her toward the door. "She's saving herself," she said. "And if any of you try to follow us or contact her again without legal cause, you will regret it more than you can imagine." They left the cottage without looking back. Valerie's car smelled like clean leather and eucalyptus, and for the first time in many months, Aline felt like she could breathe in a space not poisoned by fear. As they pulled away, her mother finally spoke again, softer this time. "I should have come sooner." Aline swallowed hard. "I should have called sooner." Valerie nodded but did not scold her. "We fix it now. We fix all of it." And Aline believed her, not because she felt brave, but because her mother arrived like a storm that refused to leave without taking back everything that had been stolen. The hotel room felt impossibly quiet after the storm they had escaped, a soft cocoon of clean sheets, muted city noise, and the reassuring presence of Valerie moving with purposeful calm. Aline sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still trembling as the weight of the past year pressed down on her chest like a collapsing ceiling. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to sleep for a week or scream until the air left her lungs. Valerie didn't push, didn't demand explanations, didn't drown her in questions. Instead, she opened her laptop, phone, and a neatly organized leather folder filled with business cards, professional contacts, and emergency resources, the tools of a woman who never entered a fight unarmed. She called a lawyer she trusted, a seasoned attorney named Victor Langdon, who specialized in property disputes and fraud. Her voice was steady, clipped, authoritative as she laid out the situation. She arranged a meeting for that evening, not tomorrow, not as soon as possible. That very evening, as if delay itself was an insult. While Valerie worked, Aline stared at her bruises in the bathroom mirror. The faint purple bloom on her arm, the yellowing shadow under her eye, the small cut near her collarbone where Christine had shoved past her days earlier. She traced them lightly, ashamed of how long she had hidden all of this. The memory of Mark's voice, sharp, dismissive, then violent, echoed behind her ribs. She wondered when exactly she had stopped recognizing the man who once walked her to the subway station with wildflowers in his hand. The worst part wasn't the fear. The worst part was realizing how easily she had accepted his family's cruelty, as if her life were something that happened to her, not something she shaped. She returned to the room and found Valerie watching her carefully, not with pity, but with a quiet fire. "Nothing that happened here is your shame," she said. "Not one moment. You survived. Now we begin again." And Aline, for the first time in months, felt the faintest spark of strength. The afternoon moved like a strategic operation. First came the police officer, a calm, competent man named Officer Ramirez, who asked questions with careful respect and took photographs of Aline's injuries for the record. He spoke directly to Valerie at times, but more often to Aline, making sure she understood her rights, her options, the protections available to her. He collected the forged documents, noting irregularities, sealing them in an evidence envelope. "This isn't going away," he assured her. "We'll investigate the fraud. and the domestic violence report stays on file whether he likes it or not." Valerie thanked him with a handshake that carried both gratitude and authority. Then came the medical visit. The clinic was only a short drive away, and the doctor on duty documented every mark with clinical precision, photographing, measuring, writing detailed notes. Aline sat still while bright lights exposed the injuries she had tried to hide under long sleeves and makeup. The doctor never once looked at her with judgment, only concern. He signed the report, printed it, handed it to Valerie, who immediately placed it in the leather folder along with the police documentation. "Evidence," she murmured, like someone assembling ammunition. By early evening, they walked into the downtown law office where Victor Langdon waited. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books, lined with polished wood shelves and legal awards. Victor was a composed man in his late 50s, with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a posture that spoke of decades spent dismantling opponents in courtrooms. Valerie explained the situation without embellishment: fraudulent transfer of property, forged signatures, coercion, physical intimidation, illegal occupation of Aline's home. Victor listened in full silence, occasionally nodding, occasionally scratching a note on a yellow legal pad. When Aline finished recounting everything, from the moment Linda began invading her life to the night Mark grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, Victor closed his notepad and folded his hands. "Your case is strong," he said. "Very strong. The original cottage deed was a premarital gift. That places it firmly in your personal estate, not joint marital property. The fraudulent transfer is easily challenged, especially with the forged signatures. The police documentation and medical reports support your testimony. In short, this will be corrected." Aline exhaled shakily, something uncoiling deep in her chest. Victor wasn't promising miracles or comfort. He was stating facts, and facts were something she could hold on to. He outlined the plan with the clarity of a general preparing for battle. File an emergency injunction to freeze the cottage from any further transactions. File a civil claim to nullify the fraudulent deed. Request an eviction order for Mark, Linda, and Christine, and pursue criminal charges for document forgery and domestic violence. "This will move faster than you think," he assured, "and it will end." When they left the office, the sky had darkened, but for the first time in a long while, Aline felt the world wasn't closing in. She rode in the passenger seat of her mother's car, watching passing streetlights streak against the window like gold bands painted across the night. Valerie reached over and squeezed her hand, not gently, but firmly, grounding her. "You are not going back there," she said. "Not ever. Not for any reason. I don't care what he says or what he promises, or how he twists your memories. You are done with that man and his family." Aline nodded slowly. "I am," she whispered, and she meant it. She wasn't the girl who slipped on metro steps and fell into a charming stranger's arms anymore. She wasn't the desperate newlywed hoping to please everyone. She wasn't the frightened woman hiding bruises behind excuses. She was someone who had fought her way back to herself, and someone who finally had a team on her side. That night, she slept in the hotel bed without waking in fear. Valerie sat by the window until dawn, answering work emails with the same calm she had carried all day, as if guarding her daughter were simply another part of her schedule. In the morning, they would begin searching for a temporary apartment, meet with Victor to file the injunction, and push the first domino of a legal sequence that would ultimately reclaim everything Mark had tried to steal. But for now, mother and daughter sat in the quiet glow of a hotel lamp, the chaos behind them, the fight ahead, and the certainty, finally, that this time they would win. Finding a new place to live became Valerie's first mission the next morning, and she approached it with the same fierce efficiency she applied to corporate takeovers. Aline followed her through a string of apartment viewings across the city, each one blurring with the next. Picturesque lofts with exposed brick, cramped studios above noisy bars, faceless corporate rentals that smelled faintly of air freshener and disappointment. Valerie rejected each one without hesitation. Too dim, too unsafe, too noisy, too old, too isolated. Aline tried to protest, insisting she didn't need anything special, but Valerie shut that down immediately. "You are not starting your new life in a shoebox that makes you feel small." Eventually, they landed on a small but bright one-bedroom on a quiet street lined with oak trees and colorful mailboxes. The living room had wide windows and sunlight that fell in long gold stripes across the floor. The kitchen was small but clean. The place was modest, but it felt peaceful, safe. Aline stood in the middle of the living room and exhaled slowly, as if the apartment itself had lifted something off her shoulders. Valerie took one look at her daughter's face, nodded, and signed a 6-month lease on the spot, paying the deposit up front without blinking. They moved in that afternoon with only 2 suitcases and a grocery bag of toiletries. Aline didn't miss the furniture or decor left behind. Everything in that cottage felt contaminated with memories of footsteps she never wanted to hear again, voices that had chipped at her confidence piece by piece. Valerie bought essentials: linens, plates, silverware, a small coffee maker, a soft gray blanket for the sofa. They unpacked in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was the kind of silence that carries purpose. Aline made the bed while Valerie set up the Wi-Fi and ordered groceries. Whenever Aline turned away, her mother looked at her with an expression that held both pride and grief. Pride in her daughter for surviving, grief that she had survived so much alone. Mark tried calling that evening. The screen lit up with his name, the same familiar font that once made Aline smile. Now it made her stomach twist. The calls came one after another, relentless, followed by a flurry of messages. First confused, then pleading, then desperate. "Please pick up. We need to talk. I'm sorry. We can fix this." Valerie saw the phone vibrating nonstop and placed it face down on the table. "Do not engage," she said. "He's losing control. He'll say anything to pull you back in." Aline nodded, though her hands trembled at the memory of his anger. She blocked his number. 2 minutes later, a message came from an unknown number. Christine. "You think you're so smart? You ruined our family. That house was ours. You will regret this." Valerie read it over Aline's shoulder, took the phone, and blocked Christine without comment. "They're spiraling," she said. "Good. That means the pressure is working." The following week became a blur of procedures, paperwork, and court filings. They met with Victor 3 times. He drafted legal motions with the laser focus of a man who found personal satisfaction in dismantling fraud. He submitted an emergency injunction to prevent Mark's family from making any changes to the cottage. He contacted the county recorder's office to flag the fraudulent deed. He filed for a restraining order based on the police documentation and medical report. Aline sat across from him in each meeting, listening as he translated her trauma into legal terms: coercion, duress, physical intimidation, fraudulent conveyance, with an odd sense of detachment. But each time he said the words, "your property," something inside her tightened with cautious hope. Meanwhile, Valerie managed her business remotely, calling her staff from the dining table, closing deals, issuing directives, and then switching instantly back into battle mode on Aline's behalf. She was unstoppable, answering emails, booking appointments, gathering evidence, speaking to detectives. Aline watched her, wondering how she had ever underestimated this woman's strength. Valerie wasn't just a successful entrepreneur. She was a force of nature, relentless when protecting someone she loved. Mark's family didn't stay quiet. Linda sent long, guilt-drenched voicemails that ranged from tearful pleas to shrill accusations. Christine tried to bait Aline through social media, posting vague rants about gold diggers and women who betray their husbands. Mark left a final voice message, his voice tight, trembling somewhere between rage and fear. "If you go through with this, if you take that house, you're destroying everything. Think carefully. You're not the victim here." Valerie listened to it once, saved a copy for evidence, and deleted it from Aline's phone. "He feels the ground shifting under his feet," she said. "Let him fall." Late one evening, after a particularly long session with Victor going over timelines and court procedures, Valerie ordered dinner to the apartment, and they sat on the floor eating takeout noodles straight from the cartons. Aline leaned back against the wall, exhausted but lighter. "Mom," she said softly, "what if they trash the place? What if they destroy everything in the cottage before they have to leave?" Valerie twirled her fork calmly. "Then we sue for damages, and we win, and you rebuild. Nothing they break will stay broken. Not anymore." Aline stared at her for a long moment, feeling something warm grow in her chest. Safety, maybe, or the return of something that used to be confidence. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. Valerie nodded. "Be scared, then do what needs to be done anyway. That's what strength looks like." As the night deepened and lights in neighboring apartments blinked out one by one, Aline sat at her small kitchen table, looking at her signed lease, her new keys, and the stack of neatly ordered legal documents that represented the first steps in reclaiming her life. She realized this quiet apartment with its dim lamp and half-unpacked boxes felt more like home than the cottage ever had while Mark's family lived there. It wasn't just the walls or the furniture. It was the absence of fear. It was the presence of her mother's unwavering certainty. It was the simple truth that she was no longer trapped. And for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to believe that everything Mark stole from her, her confidence, her safety, her home, was already on its way back. The day of the first court hearing arrived with a tension so sharp that Aline woke before sunrise, sitting upright in bed as if pulled from sleep by a thread. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every thought, and she sat in the dim gray light for a long moment before finally rising. Valerie was already up, dressed, reviewing documents at the dining table with the calm focus of someone preparing for a major presentation. "Eat something," she said without looking up. Aline managed a few bites of toast, though her stomach was tangled in knots. The idea of sitting in the same room as Mark and his mother again felt like stepping back into a nightmare. But Victor had been clear. Her presence was important. Her voice mattered. And this time, she wouldn't be standing alone. When they arrived at the courthouse, the air inside felt unnaturally cold, the fluorescent lights almost too bright. The hallway was filled with the low hum of conversations, shifting footsteps, the clatter of papers and briefcases. They found Victor near the courtroom door, impeccably dressed, carrying a file so thick it looked like a weapon. "They're already inside," he said calmly. "Don't look at them unless you want to. You're here for the judge, not for them." Aline nodded, though she couldn't stop her pulse from hammering. Valerie stood beside her like a wall, steady, immovable, radiating a quiet threat. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old wood and paper. Mark sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched stiffly, jaw clenched, wearing a suit that did nothing to hide his frayed edges. His mother sat next to him, dressed all in black, clutching a tissue dramatically, as if she were starring in some high-stakes melodrama. The only surprise was Christine's absence. Though Aline doubted her sister-in-law had avoided the hearing out of shame, she simply hated being anywhere that didn't revolve around her. Aline kept her eyes forward, gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles whitened. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, entered with the kind of presence that silenced the entire room. She listened to the preliminary statements with a neutrality that gave nothing away. Victor's voice was steady and methodical as he laid out the timeline. The original deed, the marital separation of assets, the forged documents, the fraudulent transfer of ownership, the police report, the medical documentation of injuries. He presented each piece like a puzzle fitting into place, leaving no space for interpretation. His clarity made Aline feel anchored, as if each sentence he spoke tightened the foundation under her feet. Mark's attorney attempted to counter, stumbling over arguments that the marriage made the property effectively shared. Despite the clear premarital gift, he tried to paint Aline as emotional, overreactive, confused about what she had signed. Victor cut him down with the finesse of a seasoned litigator. "If my client had signed anything," he said evenly, "the signatures on these fraudulent documents would match her legal signature, which they do not. The forensic analysis confirms forgery." The judge examined the evidence, her expression unchanging. When it was Aline's turn to speak, her voice trembled at first, but something in her spine straightened as she described the months of coercion, the isolation, the increasing hostility from Mark's family, and the moment Mark grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a bruise. She didn't dramatize or embellish. She told the truth plainly, and the truth itself had weight. When she finished, the room was silent for several long seconds. The judge addressed Mark directly. "The evidence suggests deliberate misrepresentation, coercion, and falsification of official documents. Do you have proof supporting your claims of joint ownership or financial contribution to the property?" Mark stammered something about helping around the house, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. I am referring to legal proof, not domestic chores. Do you have receipts, transfers, invoices? He looked helplessly toward his attorney, who offered nothing. No, Mark muttered. No. The hearing moved faster than Aline expected. Short recess, final statements. Then the judge returned with the ruling. The transfer of ownership is hereby nullified, she said, her voice slicing through the room with finality. The fraudulent deed is void. The property at the stated address remains the exclusive legal possession of Aline Thompson. Aline felt the breath leave her body in a rush, relief so sudden it bordered on dizziness. The judge continued. Furthermore, an eviction order is granted. The occupants currently residing in the property must vacate within 10 days. Linda let out a strangled gasp, pressing the tissue dramatically to her chest. Mark's face flushed red with anger, humiliation, or both. The judge wasn't finished. Given the evidence of physical intimidation and coercion, the court is granting a temporary restraining order, effective immediately. Aline's breath caught. Valerie reached over and squeezed her hand, not gently but firmly, reminding her she was no longer defenseless. Mark glared at them both, his eyes full of resentment, but he said nothing. He had no ground left to stand on. After the hearing, the three of them stepped out into the sunlight, and the brightness felt surreal. Aline's hands shook with adrenaline as she leaned against the railing, exhaling shakily. Victor closed the folder with a decisive snap. "This is the beginning of the end," he said. "They have 10 days, and after that you get your home back." Valerie thanked him with a handshake that communicated respect and resolve. "You were exceptional," she told him. He nodded. "Your daughter did the hard part." She stood up. As they walked toward the parking lot, Aline felt as if the world around her had tilted back into place. The fight wasn't over. Mark was still unpredictable, Linda still venomous, and Christine still vindictive. But the tide had turned. For the first time in over a year, Aline wasn't bracing for another attack, another insult, another threat. She felt her lungs expand deeply, unrestrained by fear. Valerie slipped an arm around her shoulders. "I told you," she murmured. "We fix everything." When Aline finally smiled, it wasn't hesitant or small. It was real, and it felt like the first step into a life fully reclaimed. The 10-day countdown that followed the court ruling unfolded with a slow, simmering tension that clung to Aline's nerves like static. Each morning she woke wondering what Mark and his family were doing inside her cottage, packing quietly, vandalizing the place out of spite, or plotting some last-minute scheme to derail the ruling. Valerie kept reminding her that the injunction made any further tampering a crime, yet Aline couldn't shake the sense of unease. Trauma has a way of whispering worst-case scenarios into every quiet moment. Still, she focused on rebuilding her routine, returning to work at the salon with cautious normalcy. Her co-workers greeted her warmly, though their eyes lingered a second too long on the faint marks still healing along her arms. She learned to answer questions with a simple, "Things are better now," because the truth was too heavy for casual break-room chatter. But her clients, her co-workers, the steady rhythm of her job, all of it grounded her in something that finally felt like life instead of survival. Valerie remained at her side throughout the week, alternating between business meetings on her laptop and bursts of hyper-focused strategizing with Victor. She handled stress like a machine, measured, composed, and prepared. But whenever Aline glanced at her unexpectedly, she caught flashes beneath that armor: worry, guilt, protectiveness, hard enough to bend steel. At night, they shared quiet dinners in the small kitchen of the rental apartment, eating takeout or simple meals Aline cooked, while Valerie sorted documents or returned work calls. They spoke often but lightly, both of them knowing the heavier conversations would come later, when the cottage was back in Aline's hands and the shadows of the past year had been pushed out for good. Mark's attempts to contact her grew more frantic as the eviction date approached. One night, he left a voicemail, long, rambling, desperate, claiming he loved her, that he had been under pressure, that they could still fix their marriage, that his family didn't mean any harm. Aline listened to none of it. Valerie did, saving only the parts that sounded remotely like threats and deleting the rest. Christine sent messages dripping with venom. "You think you won? You'll see." Linda's calls were the most erratic, swinging from sobbing apologies to shrieking accusations. Aline blocked every number. Victor assured her the restraining order would protect her, and that if they violated it, the consequences would be severe. But still, the fear lingered. Some people obey laws, others treat them as suggestions. The 9th day arrived with a sudden shift in the air. Cloudless sky, sun sharp as polished glass, a breeze that carried hints of spring. Aline spent the morning cleaning the apartment, trying to distract herself from imagining what state the cottage would be in when she returned. Valerie took her to lunch, a quiet cafe with soft jazz humming in the background. They talked about Aline's future, her plans, her career, whether she wanted to eventually sell the cottage and move closer to Valerie's state. For the first time, Aline allowed herself to picture a life without the Hendersons, a life where her home remained hers, where her peace wasn't a fragile thing that others could invade. She realized, with a slow kind of dawning, that her world was shifting towards something brighter. That evening, Victor called. "I spoke with the sheriff's office," he said. "They'll send an officer with us tomorrow morning to ensure the eviction is enforced. You won't be alone." Relief washed through Aline so strongly she had to sit down. She thanked him, then thanked him again, because gratitude kept tumbling out of her in raw waves. Valerie met her eyes across the room and nodded. "You see," she said, "control is coming back to you, piece by piece." The morning of the eviction, they drove to the cottage in a convoy. Valerie's car in front, Victor behind them, and a sheriff's cruiser cruising steadily at the rear. The closer they got to the property, the tighter Aline's chest became. The quiet suburban streets looked exactly as they had the day she first saw the cottage, sun-drenched, welcoming, lined with trees, neighbors walking dogs, sprinklers misting lawns. Yet everything felt different. This time she wasn't arriving as a frightened woman entering hostile territory. She was arriving with law, support, and indisputable ownership on her side. When the cottage finally came into view, Aline held her breath. The driveway was empty. No cars, no signs of movement behind the windows. Valerie parked, stepped out, and immediately scanned the area with her CEO-trained precision, assessing details like a battlefield commander. The sheriff approached the door first, knocking loudly and announcing official notice. No answer. He tried again. Still silence. Victor stepped forward. "If they aren't here," he said quietly, "that may be the best outcome we could hope for." The sheriff unlocked the door using the master key on file for such cases and pushed it open. Aline stepped inside slowly, bracing herself. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Stale air and dust, the faint lingering traces of perfume, cigarettes, and too many cheap meals. Her living room, the one she decorated with soft rugs and framed art, looked barren. The furniture she had bought or inherited remained, but everything that didn't belong to the house originally had been stripped away. Dents in the walls, a cracked lamp, a few deep scratches on the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, cupboard doors hung slightly off their hinges. The refrigerator had been emptied, unplugged and left open, dripping onto the tile. Upstairs, Christine's loft room was a disaster. Makeup stains on the vanity, glitter embedded in the carpet, a broken drawer on the nightstand. But nothing was irreparable. Nothing was devastating. The only deliberate damage was a message scrawled across the living room wall in black marker. "This was our home. You will regret this." Aline stared at the words for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. She laughed, a short, exhausted, incredulous laugh that escaped before she could stop it. "Let them try," she said quietly. Valerie stepped beside her, placing a hand between her shoulders. "We're repainting that wall tomorrow," she replied, "and then you move forward." The sheriff confirmed the property was vacated, filed the official paperwork, and left. Victor did a walkthrough documenting everything, nodding with approval. "Considering who we were dealing with," he said, "this is practically a miracle." Aline walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, running her fingers along the window frames. And something inside her, something that had been twisted into knots for too long, finally began to loosen. This was her home again, her space, her future. And as she stood in the quiet light of her reclaimed living room, Aline realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The days that followed the eviction moved in a strange, almost dreamlike rhythm. Aline found herself drifting between exhaustion and exhilaration, stunned by the sudden quiet of the cottage. After so many months of living under the constant noise of Linda's criticism, Christine's petty insults, and Mark's simmering anger, the silence felt unreal. The air inside the house settled differently now, lighter, almost gentle. Sunlight poured across the floors in wide, uninterrupted bands, and Aline realized how long it had been since she had seen the cottage in its true form, not as a battlefield, but as a home. Valerie wasted no time organizing a deep cleaning crew, a team of 4 professionals who descended upon the cottage with industrial vacuums, detergents, and a determination that matched her own. Aline watched as they scrubbed stains from the kitchen counters, ripped out the dirty curtains Linda had insisted added warmth, and sanitized every inch of Christine's chaotic loft. The cleaning lasted 2 full days, and by the end, the cottage felt like it had sloughed off the last remnants of the Hendersons, as if purging them from its walls. Once the cleaners left, Valerie turned her attention to the damaged wall with the black marker message, studying it with a critical eye. "We're not patching over this," she said. "We're repainting the entire room." Aline helped tape the trim and spread drop cloths over the floors. As she dipped her roller into the pale cream paint and swept it across the wall, covering the bitter words stroke by stroke, she felt something inside her shift. Every pass of the roller felt like the closing of a chapter, layer after layer softening, erasing, rewriting. When the entire room was done, the cottage looked like itself again, warm, welcoming, unscarred. Repairs followed. Valerie hired a trusted handyman who replaced the broken drawer, fixed the squeaky hinges, patched the dents in the drywall, and reinstalled a few appliances the Hendersons had left unplugged. He worked with quiet efficiency, often tipping his hat toward Aline as if wordlessly acknowledging that restoring a home is an act of healing. Aline stayed busy sweeping floors, arranging furniture, washing linens, and reorganizing the kitchen. There was something profoundly therapeutic in cleaning out the spaces that Linda had claimed as her domain. The pantry, the fridge, the cupboards, wiping away fingerprints Aline never wanted to see again. But while the cottage was being restored, something else was happening inside Aline. She felt herself expanding, filling the space in ways she hadn't imagined possible. The fear that had once controlled her movements now shrank to the corners of her mind, overshadowed by the confidence she had begun reclaiming. Little by little, her shoulders straightened, her voice regained strength, and her thoughts stopped echoing with self-doubt. She no longer flinched at sudden noises or dreaded unexpected knocks on the door. She slept through the night without jolting awake. The house no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a sanctuary. Valerie's presence helped shape that transformation. She continued working remotely, taking calls from the patio or kitchen, balancing her corporate obligations with a watchful eye on her daughter. But she also began pulling back, giving Aline space to stand on her own. "You don't need me here forever," she said one morning, sipping coffee by the window. "You're strong enough now to build whatever life you want next." Aline felt a pang at the thought of her mother leaving, but she knew Valerie was right. The safety she felt now wasn't because her mother was physically present. It was because her mother had taught her how to hold her ground. Still, Valerie wasn't leaving without tying off every loose end. She and Victor reviewed the final legal documents, preparing for the restitution phase, calculating damages for the vandalism, the fraudulent transfer, and the emotional distress. Victor assured them the next hearing would be procedural, a formality to finalize the restitution claim. Mark had already attempted to delay, claiming financial hardship, but Victor laughed it off. "He can't delay the inevitable," he said. "The court has already ruled. We're simply collecting what you're owed." Meanwhile, the Hendersons had gone oddly silent. No calls, no messages, no posts from Christine. Victor suggested they were regrouping, licking their wounds, and figuring out their next move. Aline imagined them crammed inside Linda's cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, Mark on the sagging couch, Christine on her battered cot, Linda clutching her tissue box like a shield. The image didn't bring joy, but it did bring clarity. They lived the life they earned. As the cottage finally neared completion, Valerie sat with Aline on the newly cleaned living room floor, the fresh paint smelling faintly of lemon and new beginnings. "I'm leaving soon," she said gently. Aline leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "I know," she replied, "but I'm okay." Valerie wrapped an arm around her. "You're better than okay. You're coming back to yourself." Aline looked around the room, at the sunlight reflecting off the freshly painted walls, at the furniture arranged just the way she liked it, and felt something settle deep inside her, a quiet certainty that the worst part of her life was finally behind her. The cottage no longer held ghosts. It held possibility. She had survived chaos. She had reclaimed her home. She had reclaimed herself. And soon she would reclaim everything else they'd tried to take. The days after the cottage was fully restored settled into a steady, almost peaceful rhythm, though underneath that calm ran a current of anticipation. Aline knew another confrontation with Mark and his family was inevitable, not because she wanted one, but because justice rarely ends at the return of what was stolen. It must also address the harm done. Victor prepared the restitution case meticulously, gathering receipts, photos of damage, repair invoices, cleaning costs, and the forensic analysis of the forged documents. Valerie helped organize everything into neat folders, color-coded and labeled with the precision of someone who had built an empire by never letting chaos win. Aline assisted where she could, filing, scanning, reviewing statements. Each time she placed a new piece of evidence into the binder, she was reminded that this wasn't vengeance. It was accountability. Yet even with the legal storm building, Aline spent more time than she expected simply living. She sat on the porch in the mornings with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood slowly awaken. She reorganized her home office, hung new curtains, planted small succulents on the kitchen windowsill. She even bought a soft blue throw blanket for the couch, a shade she loved, but one Linda had once declared tacky. Each small decision felt like reclaiming a tiny part of herself that had been buried under months of criticism and control. At the salon, her coworkers noticed the change, her posture straighter, her tone firmer, her eyes brighter. One evening, her coworker Bianca pulled her aside and said, "I don't know what happened, but you look lighter." Aline smiled, a real one. "I just came home," she said. Valerie continued to stay nearby, though she gradually gave Aline more space. She returned to full work hours, taking video calls from her business partners, approving budgets, reviewing proposals. Still, she checked in with Aline every morning and every night, not out of worry alone, but out of habit, a mother's instinct sharpened by a year of silence she regretted. "I won't make that mistake again," she told Aline one evening over dinner. "When something feels wrong, we talk. No more suffering in the shadows." Aline nodded, feeling both guilty and grateful at once. "I should have told you sooner," she admitted. Valerie shook her head. "What matters is you told me in time." The calm was broken the next afternoon when Victor called with new information. "The Hendersons have filed a counterclaim," he said. Aline felt her breath hitch. "On what grounds?" Victor sighed with a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "Emotional damages. They're claiming your actions caused them distress and financial hardship." Aline blinked, stunned, then almost laughed. "They illegally stole my home," she said, "and they're claiming emotional damages?" Victor's voice was steady. "It's a scare tactic. They don't have a case. We'll dismantle it easily, but it means we'll see them again in court sooner than expected." Valerie's calm facade cracked just slightly. "Bring it on," she muttered. "Let them say whatever nonsense they want. Truth wins." As the court date approached, Aline noticed something strange. She wasn't afraid, not the way she had been during the first hearing, when her chest felt squeezed by dread and her hands couldn't stop shaking. Now she felt something closer to resolve. She had already faced the worst of the Hendersons. She had survived the threats, the manipulation, the humiliation. She had reclaimed her home. The next confrontation would be the final one, and she was ready. On the morning of the hearing, Aline dressed with intention. A deep green blouse Valerie had bought her, black slacks, hair neatly pulled back. She wanted to look calm, competent, unshakable. When she and Valerie walked into the courthouse, Victor greeted them with his usual composed nod. "They're already inside," he said, "and their attorney looks like he wants to quit." Aline smiled faintly. "He probably does." Inside the courtroom, the Hendersons sat in a tight row like a trio of storm clouds. Mark's posture was stiff, his expression attempting confidence but landing somewhere between bitterness and panic. Linda clutched a handkerchief dramatically, as though her suffering were the center of the universe. Christine was finally present, arms crossed, lips curled in a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. Aline sat at her table and kept her gaze forward, not denying their presence, but refusing to be pulled back into their orbit. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The Hendersons' attorney presented their counterclaim with unsteady arguments that Aline's sudden departure caused financial chaos, that they had contributed emotionally to the upkeep of the cottage, that they had invested time and effort into the household. The judge's expression remained unreadable, though at one point she raised a brow at the phrase, emotional labor of maintaining harmony. When Victor spoke, his tone was precise, unyielding. He presented receipts, photos of the damage, screenshots of threatening texts. Then he ended with a sentence so clean and sharp it cut through the room like a blade. They are not victims of my client. They are victims of their own entitlement. The judge deliberated briefly before delivering a ruling that extinguished the Hendersons' counterclaim entirely. There is no legal or factual foundation, she stated firmly. Then she added something unexpected. Furthermore, given the evidence of harassment, manipulation, and attempted fraud, additional penalties will be considered in the restitution phase. Christine gasped. Linda stiffened. Mark's jaw tightened until the muscle twitched. Aline exhaled slowly, feeling a warmth spread across her chest, a mixture of vindication and release. When they stepped out of the courtroom, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching dust in the air like glitter. Victor turned to Aline with a rare smile. The tide is not just in your favor, he said. It's carrying you forward. Valerie rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. You're winning, she whispered. Not just the case, your life. Aline felt the truth of those words settle inside her, solid, unshakable. She had crossed a threshold she once thought impossible. The Hendersons no longer had power over her, not legally, not emotionally, not at all. And the final chapter of their reckoning had only just begun. In the days following the collapse of the Hendersons' counterclaim, the air around Aline seemed to shift permanently. Something heavy had lifted, not just from her shoulders, but from the walls of her cottage, from the hallways she once walked with trepidation, from the rooms that had held her fears like stored static. Now, those fears dissipated each morning she woke in her own bed, in her own home, without the tension of someone listening for her footsteps or criticizing the way she folded towels. Valerie could see the difference immediately. You're breathing deeper, she remarked one afternoon as they prepared documents for the restitution hearing. Aline ran a hand along the smooth, freshly painted wall and nodded softly. Because for the first time, I'm not waiting for something bad to happen. Still, the legal battle wasn't finished. Victor spent the next few days fine-tuning the restitution claim with the meticulousness of a surgeon. He itemized the damages, emotional distress supported by medical evaluations, the cost of cleaning and repairs, the value of stolen items, the professional fees associated with reversing the fraudulent transfer. He even included compensation for temporary housing and lost work hours. Every number, every invoice, every photograph of damage formed a lattice of proof too solid to shake. We are not just ensuring justice, he told Aline. We are building a wall they cannot climb. Valerie smiled at that. Music to my ears. Although the Hendersons had been publicly embarrassed by the last ruling, they weren't gone. They lurked in the background like the last flickers of a dying fire still capable of burning. Christine posted cryptic messages on social media, thinly veiled attacks about traitors and women who steal houses. Linda attempted to play the martyr online, describing herself as suffering from unimaginable grief caused by cruelty. Mark remained the quietest, though occasionally he left a message on a new number Aline didn't recognize until she blocked it. He sounded defeated, grasping for control he no longer possessed. You owe us, he said in one recording. You can't just walk away and act like we meant nothing. But the truth was he meant nothing now, nothing to her peace, nothing to her future. When the day of the restitution hearing arrived, Aline did not tremble. She felt an unusual steadiness, like the center of gravity in her chest had settled. She dressed with precision, earth-toned blouse, black skirt, hair tied neatly. Valerie hugged her tightly before they left the cottage. Today isn't about fighting, she said. It's about finishing. As they entered the courthouse, Aline inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air steady her. Victor met them at the entrance with the same quiet confidence he always carried. "The judge will have little patience for theatrics," he said, "and your evidence is overwhelming." Inside the courtroom, the Hendersons looked smaller than before. Whether it was the weight of repeated legal defeats or the exhaustion of losing their unearned comfort, something about them seemed diminished. Linda's dramatic flair had waned. Her voice was hushed instead of sharp, her posture drooping. Christine's face was pale and tight-lipped, her signature arrogance hidden behind forced indifference. Mark sat between them, shoulders rigid, fingers interlocked in a white-knuckled grip. Aline observed them not with fear, but with distance, like people she once knew in another life. They no longer commanded space in her mind. They were simply obstacles to step past. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Victor presented the restitution claim clearly, logically, without embellishment. He showed the timeline of events, the evidence of abuse and coercion, the costs associated with restoring the cottage to livable condition, and the expenses Aline incurred while displaced. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. The truth had weight enough. The Hendersons' attorney attempted feebly to counter the amounts, arguing that market value of certain items should be reassessed, that Aline exaggerated the emotional toll, that repairs were cosmetic. The judge cut through these objections with sharp questions that left the attorney fumbling. "Cosmetic repairs?" she repeated. "Are you referring to the hateful message scrawled on her living room wall?" Silence followed. When Aline was asked to speak, she rose and described her experience with composed clarity. She explained the fear, the isolation, the financial exploitation, and the emotional strain of living under constant hostility. She spoke not with anger, but with honesty, and her voice did not waver. When she finished, the judge nodded slowly, as if acknowledging not only her testimony, but her resilience. The ruling was delivered with swift, decisive authority. The judge approved nearly all requested restitution, including damages for emotional harm and legal fees. Additionally, she imposed a penalty for the fraudulent transfer attempt. The conduct exhibited was calculated, harmful, and in clear violation of state law, she declared. Recompense is not just justified, it is necessary. Linda gasped. Christine's hands clenched in her lap. Mark's jaw tensed so tightly it looked painful. Aline felt no triumph as she absorbed the ruling, only closure. The courtroom no longer felt like an arena. It felt like the final page of a book she'd been forced to read. As everyone stood to leave, Valerie wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders and whispered, "It's done." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Victor shook Aline's hand, offering a rare smile. "Your courage made this possible," he said. "Most people break under pressure like this. You didn't." Valerie added, "She's a Thompson." Aline laughed softly at that, the sound carrying a freedom she hadn't felt in more than a year. That evening, back at the cottage, Aline sat alone in the living room while the golden light of sunset spilled across the floor. The house was quiet, warm, hers. Everything that had been taken was returned. Everything broken had been repaired. Everything uncertain was now settled. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. There was still the matter of what came after reclaiming a life. The weeks that followed the restitution ruling unfolded with a quiet, steady rhythm that felt almost surreal after so much turmoil. The cottage no longer hummed with tension or fear. It breathed. Mornings began with soft light filtering through the new curtains, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen, and the simple pleasure of moving through a home that belonged fully, unquestionably, to Aline. She no longer double-checked locks or listened for footsteps in the hallway. She no longer held her breath when the phone buzzed. The silence was peaceful, not ominous. And in that peace, she felt the subtle but powerful return of something she hadn't realized she'd lost, her ability to imagine a future. Valerie slowly transitioned back to her own life out of state, though she remained in constant contact. Calls every morning, messages throughout the day, video chats during dinner. More than once, she offered to buy a second home in the same neighborhood, just in case. But Aline laughed each time, assuring her mother she was ready to stand on her own again. "You taught me how," she said. Valerie never argued with that. Before she left, she hugged her daughter fiercely on the freshly repainted porch and whispered, "You are stronger than anything that tried to break you." Aline held on tightly, absorbing those words like a promise. After Valerie left, Aline took her time settling into the next chapter of her life. She remodeled the cottage bit by bit, changing light fixtures, repainting rooms, replacing furniture that carried too many memories. She planted flowers along the walkway, hydrangeas, lilacs, lavender. Each small transformation felt like stitching her identity back into the house. At work, she took on extra shifts, not because she needed the distraction, but because she felt capable again. Her clients asked for her specifically, drawn to the renewed calm in her voice, the gentleness in her manner. When Bianca joked that Aline seemed glowier than usual, Aline smiled. "I just finally have room to breathe." One evening, after a particularly long shift, Aline returned home to find a small envelope in her mailbox. No return address, just her name written in a handwriting she recognized instantly. Her breath hitched. She stood on the porch staring at the envelope for a long moment before finally tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. "I'm sorry for everything. I never meant for things to go that far. Please forgive me." No signature, but none was needed. Aline closed her eyes, letting the paper hang from her fingers. A younger version of herself might have cried, or trembled, or wondered if she should reply. But that version no longer existed. She folded the note neatly, placed it back in the envelope, slid it into a drawer inside the house, and closed it without ceremony. Some apologies come too late to matter. Some wounds heal only when you stop reopening them. The following weekend, Aline invited a few co-workers over for a small housewarming gathering. They brought pastries, sparkling cider, and a houseplant someone jokingly named Valerie Jr. They laughed, ate, explored the cottage, complimented the decor. For the first time in a long time, Aline filled her home with people she chose, not people who demanded space or drained the air from the room. As the evening light softened into gold and gentle laughter drifted across the living room, she felt something inside her settle into place. Her life was no longer defined by survival. It was defined by choice. A few days later, Aline sat on the back porch during sunset, her favorite mug warming her hands as she watched the sky shift through shades of peach and amber. She thought about everything she had endured, the fear, the manipulation, the loneliness. But she also thought about the strength she had found, the boundaries she had built, and the mother who had stood beside her like a shield. The woman she had become felt older, wiser, and braver. Not because she had conquered her past, but because she had reclaimed her present. She didn't know exactly what the future held. Maybe she would continue working at the salon. Maybe she would pursue new training. Maybe she would even start fresh in another city one day. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever she chose next, she would choose it freely. No one would ever again decide her life for her. The story of the cottage, the theft, the betrayal, the fight, the victory, became just one chapter in a life that was beginning again. Some scars would stay, of course. Healing does not erase history, but those scars no longer ached. They simply reminded her of who she had been and who she refused to become again. As twilight settled over the cottage, fireflies flickering near the yard, Aline closed her eyes and breathed deeply. A slow, steady, liberated breath. The kind of breath that belongs to someone who has walked through fire and found herself on the other side, unburned. Her life was hers again. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt ready, truly ready, for whatever came next. If this story left you thinking about what a mother should do in a moment like this, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching and supporting these stories.